Hello, friends. Just a kind of a spoiler. There's no big aha moments in my talk. There's no broken households. There's no prison sentences. There's no drug abuse. Sorry, Mary. But it's more like a journey story rather than a big aha moment. So my journey has taken a few bends along the way, and mostly it's mostly about the church life that I started with and where I've ended up here with all my other friends. So it's kind of enlightening to me when I was looking at what I was going to talk about today, is because I had to kind of reflect back on where I've been. And it's an interesting journey when you go back and you start looking at what life decisions you've made and how you actually got here, and what decisions you made and what decisions somebody else made, and you're living them. So it's kind of an interesting way to take a look at it. Sure. A lot of you know that my background is Finnish, so my background, I mean, that's where the story is going to start. My parents immigrated here after World War II. Finland was kind of in a wreck situation, and my parents, they didn't come together. They met here, so they came by a different journey. My father came first to Chicago and then to LA, and then he got drafted to the Korean War, ended up in Japan for 2 years. My mother came a different route. She came to New York, and then by knowing a friend, came to Los Angeles. So she came to LA. My father got my discharge from the army, and they both met at a Finnish Lutheran church in downtown LA. So it was they grew up about 50 miles apart in Finland. So on the other side of the planet, they met each other. This doesn't work?
I think that'll work better for you.
It's not.
Does it seem like it's getting feedback?
Yeah. Oh.
That might work better for you.
Hello? Better? Winner. That wasn't me. So anyway, after World War II, or about that time, there were a lot of Finnish people had immigrated to the United States. Most of them to the upper Midwest, which is a big Finnish population, Swedish, Norwegian, up in Michigan and Minnesota. But there was a population in Los Angeles, and they created a Finnish Lutheran church in downtown LA. It was on West Adams Boulevard near USC. And it really wasn't a church. It was really more of a converted big house. One of those stately 1920s mansions that they have in that area of the city. The downstairs was converted into a church, and the upstairs, the pastor lived there. So it was kind of a convenient location for him. The living room was kind of the church with a simple altar and these really hard steel chairs, folding chairs that you had to sit in, because it was really a converted house. And so my parents met there, and then I was born after that, and I was baptized at that same church, and so was my brother, and we went to that church for quite a few years. But the problem with that is the whole service was in Finnish. So I understand Finnish, I could speak Finnish, but some of the words were not the ones we use at home. So there was a lot of words that I was like, I don't know what that means, and we really didn't get into religious discussion at home. So a lot of them were, I hear that word every week or when we went to church, but then I wouldn't really capture what that really meant. So I was born in Los Angeles, and I went to that church, and we lived in the Atwater Village area between kind of Hollywood and Glendale, probably most of my life. And we had a pretty normal household, middle class, in a middle class neighborhood. There was nothing special. There was no abuse. There was no alcohol abuse. There was, it was just a quiet little street with quiet parents, but we only spoke Finnish at home because that's what they wanted to speak. So needless to say, when I went to kindergarten, I didn't know any English because we didn't speak English at home. So whatever I learned on television was all I knew. So there was no English as a second language programs then. But kindergarten was a lot easier then. You go to school, you have snack, you go take a nap, you go outside, you know, it was pretty play with blocks, and then it's time to go home. So, now you have to practically read when you're in kindergarten. So that was kind of my background in schooling. It took me maybe a year or two to figure out English language, because they didn't really take you aside and say, okay, here are the words you're supposed to know. You just learn them from the other kids, or you learn them from the teacher. So it was kind of a awkward start to schooling. Um, we lived in a little tiny house. It was probably 800 square feet. There was only four of us, my brother and I and my parents. But along the way, they decided they were going to rebuild the house. So they were going to tear down the old house and put a new one on the same lot, because they liked that neighborhood. So we didn't have a place to live. So we went off and moved into the church. Because it was a big upstairs, it was, probably a 5,000 square foot house. The bottom floor was the church, and the pastor lived by himself on the upper floor, which was probably 4 bedrooms and 2 baths. So we moved in for a whole school year into the church. Well, it was kind of strange to live in the same place as your pastor lives in. There was a lot of awkward. I was probably around 8 years old. I think I was in the 3rd grade. My brother was in kindergarten. So we went to the neighborhood school, whatever happened to be in that neighborhood, for a whole school year. So we left all the friends behind and went to school. So that was just a little side thing. I just thought it was funny that live in a place where your pastor lives. The church that we because it was an old house, the congregation was maybe 200 people at the most. Of that, maybe 50 would show up in any one week. But there wasn't too many chairs anyway, so 50 people was pretty good, because if you get too many people, you'd have to be standing in the back. But the service was also completely in Finnish, so it was a little hard for me to understand. And our family was one of the younger families of the congregation, so a lot of them were older. Either they didn't have children, or their children were so old that they had already moved out of the house and didn't come to church. So there was no Sunday school, so we sat on the metal chairs and created noise, and our parents shushed us, and like all kids do. So there was, when there's no Sunday school, it was hard to sit through something you're not understanding to start with, and have people, talking, and there was stand up, sit down, sing the song, and then you're hoping that it gets over pretty soon so you can go eat. So on that note, for the Finnish congregation, or the Finnish immigrants, they like to hang together like all immigrants do. So the church was kind of a community activity. It wasn't really so much the service, it was the community activity afterwards. So every week there would be coffee, of course, because it's Finnish, and there would be pastries, or they serve lunch or whatever. But that was kind of the big draw. It was the community part of it, which was fine for me, because we love to eat, and so that was great for my brother and I. We would go eat, and they would hang out for maybe an hour or two, and then we'd go home. So that was kind of the big activity for them. But unfortunately, with the service being in Finnish, I wasn't really getting anything out of the service, but the community part was really great. So along the way, the church kind of lost the lease on the house, and they had moved. Then they ended up moving to sharing a space with a Swedish Anglican church it was close to USC. I'm not remember what street it was on, but it was a real church. It had like a real church building, and they had like stained glass and pews and an organ, and we were like, well, this is great. But the service was still in Finnish, so I still didn't have any idea. But the surroundings were a lot better. But the good thing about the Swedish thing is that they were similar enough that I could go to confirmation with the Swedish kids, because there wasn't too many of us Finnish kids. So luckily, the associate pastor for the Swedish church agreed to take us as confirmation kids, and that's where I was confirmed then. So I was actually confirmed in a Swedish church instead of a Finnish church. So once I was confirmed, then I was it was by the time I get to be about 16, then, everybody's 16 goes to work. So once you start going to work and you're, working weekends, then of course you're working Sunday morning too, because you're the young kid and nobody else wants to work on Sunday morning. So of course, church going got to be kind of sporadic at that point. It was Christmas and Easter for sure. Other days, I'm not so sure. But it's one of those those things that happens when you're a teenager. You kind of fall away a little bit, and it wasn't really this finished service was kind of wasn't really doing anything for me except for the food, I guess. But there was a couple that used to come to our church, George and Leah, and they were maybe a little bit older than my parents, and I don't remember what he did, but they were kind of the pillars of the church, and they always had the kind of they spoke of God's love, and they kind of had a peace about them. And they were always happy, and they would talk to the kids, and even us teenagers, rebellious teenagers, and ask, how's school, and how are you doing, and kind of checking up on us on a regular basis. And I thought that was kind of, nobody else in the church, they all knew our names, and they would say hi, but then it'd go off and talk Finnish to somebody else. But they were the only two that actually came up and actually interfaced with the kids. And it was, my brother and I and my cousin, and maybe two more, so there wasn't that many kids to talk to. But so as years went on, then the congregation got smaller and older as, people passed on or they stopped coming to church because they couldn't get there anymore. So the pastor retired, and then they ended up having to move from that Swedish church to a little church in the valley. And they had a lay pastor for a while, and I think that pretty much that was kind of the end of the church. It dwindled down to maybe 20 people, then it was 10 people, and they finally couldn't do it anymore. It just didn't make financial sense, and they shut it down. There used to be another Finnish congregation in the valley, and they went kind of through the same decline, which is typical for small churches, I think. But there's still a Finnish service in Los Angeles. It's in Santa Monica at a church. It's once a month, and there's a pastor that flies in from Arizona to give the service. So if you're Finnish and you want to go to church, that's going to be your one and only shot every month. So once I graduated from college, I started working, and I moved out of the house into an apartment, and I hadn't been going to church very much because, of course, when you're in college, you have no time to go to church. You're working or you're studying, one or the other. So I tried various churches in the Glendale area. One was Lutheran, one was Presbyterian, and then there was this place called the Self-Realization Fellowship, which was kind of a scary place. It was one of those round kind of things with no cross on the wall, and I think they had guards at the doors to make sure you didn't leave. I went there once. I was happy to get to the parking lot without having to sign up for something. My wife Barbie and I were working in the same store at that time, and that's where I met her. But she was Catholic and I wasn't, which wasn't a big deal because when you go to a Finnish church and you don't really have any Bible study or anything else, whether you're Lutheran or Finnish didn't make it too much difference to me. So I would say, oh, well, that's fine, And so when we were dating, we'd go to Mass together on Saturday night, because they have a Saturday night Mass, because if you didn't want to go on Sunday, you could go Saturday night, and it would still count. There was this counting thing, if it didn't count, it only counted on certain times. So we go to Mass at 5:30, and then we go to dinner. So, but unfortunately, my parents didn't think that was such a hot idea. They said, well, she's Catholic. And I said, well, I know that. Well, she's Catholic, right? And I said, well, I know that. Well, I wasn't too deterred anyway. So, but the good thing about the Catholic Mass, it was in English, so at least I could understand what was going on, which was great. But, I wasn't allowed to receive communion because I wasn't Catholic. And so I said, well, what's the deal with that, But of course, in the Finnish church, you only had communion once a month anyway, which was, I think, was her first Sunday, which I don't know, somehow I always missed that. that day that we would actually have communion. But I think the only time I really remember getting communion was the day I was confirmed. And the rest of the time, I think I missed it every other time. So receiving communion wasn't a big deal. I said, okay, well, I'll go up and get my blessing, I'll stand there and they'll give me the business. So those people who've been to this in the Mass, they know what I'm talking about. So before we got married, we had to go through these educational sessions, were about people who are marrying non-Catholics, so that everybody knows what they're getting themselves into. They were kind of intimidating, they go in there and they kind of lean on you a lot to, see if you want to convert or not. And from what I've seen, I was going, I'll think about it, I'll let you know. But I did have to sign a paper that says I would bring my children up Catholic. They make you sign that, as a promise. And I said, okay, well, I guess that's okay. So that was the interesting thing about the Catholic Church is it's kind of the opposite of what the Finnish church was. There was a lot of religion, but very little community. So you go to church, and people would basically run out the door to get out, and in 20 minutes after the service, there was nobody here. Nobody knew each other. Everybody would just run off, and so it was kind of a strange dynamic. It didn't seem like anybody's really happy at the service. It was very somber. You come in, you bow, take your seat, you stand, sit, kneel, stand, sit, kneel, and sing a few songs. And but it was the part I kind of missed in the Catholic service was the pastors. A lot of them didn't have a lot of worldly experience. None of them were married. None of them had kids. None of them had real jobs, so they couldn't really. They were priests basically the whole time. They couldn't relate to us to going to working at McDonald's when they were going to school, or they couldn't relate to baseball or football or anything. So it was a very difficult, some of them were better than others. Obviously the senior pastors or senior priests and the Monsignor, of course, would have some stories. So I think they canned them and they used them every year. But it was, you kind of have the standard talking points because they rotate that way. So we were living in Montrose at the time, and we went to the Catholic church that my in-laws went to, which was fine because they like to go to breakfast afterwards. So we'd go and we'd go to mass at 7:30, which was the early mass, and then we go to breakfast. Well, there was a rush out the door to see who's going to be out to the parking lot first, because you'd see the same people at breakfast, but they've already ordered. But by the time we got there, I said, well, how did they get here before we did? But so we were married in the Catholic Church, but we had because my parents were kind of leaning on me, that we had a joint priest-pastor wedding, which was very unusual, and I was surprised the church would let us do that. So it was kind of a joint wedding with our Finnish pastor and the Catholic priest. So it was a kind of an interesting thing. One of the things the Catholic Church doesn't do is they don't have pews with Bibles in them, so you don't read anything while you're in church. The funny joke was that the only thing that Catholics read is the bulletin. So because the Bible is not available, the pastor or the priest will tell you what the story is, and then tell you what it said. In the church in La Cañada, there was a Monsignor and the senior pastor would pretty much take their vacation during the summertime. And around Memorial Day, these young Irish priests would show up, and they would be there all summer, and while the Monsignor and the senior pastor were on vacation. And they were sometimes, some of them were kind of hard to understand. They got that little brogue thing going on, and you're going, what did he say? So there was a lot of turnover that way as far as the who was saying what. And then Labor Day, it would kind of revert back to its normal form. But the across the street there was St. Francis High School, and there were some Franciscan priests there that were, they would come over and do mass every once in a while, and they were a little bit more worldly. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure what the difference between Franciscans and non are, but there was a couple of them that would come over and really give really good sermons and really connect with the mass. So we were doing that. In '96, we moved up to Santa Clarita for a job move. Started attending the Blessed Kiteri Church over on it's on Copper Hill, and now it's called Saint Kiteri. I'm not sure what happened. She must have performed some miracles in the last 300 years since she died. But there was at that point they didn't have a church. It was only the fellowship hall, and they were still raising money to build the church. But we never felt like we had any connection to that church, and we would go, and just like the other church, you bow, you sit, you kneel, you stand. I mean, the service was exactly the same, but the priests were okay. They would give a pretty good sermon by reading the reading over 2 or 3 times and expounding on it. But again, it was not a happy place. Nobody ever talked to anybody else. If you saw somebody you knew, you kind of give them a little kind of a wave, like you can't wave in church. So we always felt like it was kind of stifling. And even my wife is Catholic, and she knew better, but she could tell that I was uncomfortable when I was at the church. So it didn't get any better. And I don't know if anybody, those of you that have been to Blessed Kiteri, they know, or St. Kiteri, they know the parking lot there is a nightmare. I mean, they must have taken after Trader Joe's as far as figuring out what kind of parking lot they'd like to have. There's like one little entrance in and one little entrance out, and they both dump onto Copper Hill into the traffic. So people who wanted to leave church early, they left after communion. They were, after communion, about the fourth of the church was missing. They were all in line to get out of the parking lot already. So community was definitely lacking. Sometimes we would see people, outside the doors there, maybe a family that my daughter would go to cheer with, or my son played baseball with, something like that. We chit-chat for a couple of minutes, and then everybody go, okay, we got to get going. And they'd run off, and again, 20 minutes later, the church is completely empty. Nobody stayed. Nobody talked. So it was kind of, the religious part was meaningful, but the community part was completely lacking. So I was kind of looking for that balance. It's how do we get there from here? That there needs to be a church family, but that's not a church family if everybody runs away. So one of the other things, they were trying to build a church building, so everything became about fundraising there, because the archdiocese, I guess, doesn't give them any money to build a building. It's if you want to build a church, you go find the money yourself. So that's what everything became. The kids went to CCD, which is their kind of child, education program, and you had to pay for materials, as they called it, and it was a lot of money. I said, well, what kind of materials are they giving them? So they, we had 2 kids, so we had to pay for each one, and then a little time later, then they would do a CCD fundraiser. So you'd be selling candy bars and okay. I said, well, wait a minute, I thought we already gave them money. So we got through it all, and I think we bought mostly candy bars ourselves because we were just too embarrassed to go to everybody else's house and try to pawn off $1 candy bars to everybody. So the kids were confirmed, which was fine, and then the fundraising for the church started really going to town. They didn't have like a big capital campaign where they just said, okay, everybody give what you can, and we'll figure it out from there. They kept picking at everybody instead of just saying one big campaign. So everything was a fundraiser. If they had an event, it was a fundraiser. So if they had a carnival, boy, the tickets were expensive. It's kind of like OLPH does their fish fry. That's a fundraiser. So fundraising and Cardinal Mahoney pretty much sealed the deal for my wife, and she finally said, "Okay, I'm not going to do this anymore. I can't." His decrees, and I'm not going to get into what they were, but kind of sealed the deal that we're not going to church anymore. So there's my church history kind of died at that point, because it wasn't the church that I really was into, but now we weren't going to church at all. So she kind of said, "Oh, we're not going to do this," and so we stopped for a couple of years, I think. But I kind of felt that I needed something, because sitting at home and not doing anything and not being able to go out and not having any group of friends that you could get together that kind of like-minded people was kind of grating on me. So and I didn't know anybody who went to church on a regular basis. I mean, everybody goes to church Christmas and Easter, but I didn't know anybody who said, "Hey, you should go to my church. We have a great church." And I didn't have, so nobody invited me to church. So got on the internet and looked up Lutheran churches in Santa Clarita, and here's one. Let's go try it. As Barbie, I said, "You want to go? Let's go see what this new church looks like?" No, I'm not quite ready yet. Yeah, maybe she will be someday. She's a Easter, Christmas attendee right now. But CLC was very welcoming. I think Hank introduced himself before I could even find a seat. So I said, "Oh, well, I like this place. There's people who actually welcome you here." And at that time, it was Pastor Dan and Pastor Joe, and they were putting together some pretty nice sermons on different topics, and kind of had a better feel for pulling real life examples together and really connecting you. And so I felt really, really happy about that. And I said, "Well, this is a good fit. I better come back next week." And I came back next week, and I think Hank introduced himself again to me. And so I said, "Oh, okay. Well, it's 2 weeks in a row somebody came over to introduce themselves. I think this must be okay." So this church, there was Bibles in the pews, and you could read the text yourself, and there was a good community afterwards. People didn't run to the parking lot right away. There was like coffee, and people would mingle and introduce themselves and find out how you're doing, and really care, which is what I was looking for. And so, funny story is, we came right after I started. We came to a Christmas service. It was probably Christmas Eve. So we were sitting in the back over there someplace, and it was my wife and I and my daughter and my son, and they were early teens, I guess, at that point. And so my daughter leans over and says, "Dad, where's the king chair?" I was going, "What are you talking about?" Well, they've only been to a Catholic church, and in a Catholic church, the priest sits in a giant chair, right here facing the audience. Well, she said she called it the king chair. So I was going, "We don't have a king chair. They just sit in the front row." Really? So I said, "It's kind of different than the church you're used to." So anyway, there's my story. It goes from all community to and no religion, basically, because I'm not going to understand it. And it goes to the other side, which is all religion and no community, which was okay. And now we're kind of the Goldilocks and the Three Bears, just right in the middle. So I kind of feel really blessed to be here, and that was kind of my journey to where I am now. And I've been here 15 years now, and I consider this my church home. So thank you to all my friends. I picked Psalm 16 as "You make known to me the path of life." So a lot of us, we don't really know how our path gets to where we are. And we all came from different places with different backgrounds and different choices. All it would have taken is one choice 30 years ago, and I probably wouldn't be here. I'd be someplace else. So it's kind of an interesting thing. I'm kind of curious to see what happens next. So there's my story. Thank you.